morning, and welcome my people. Buenos dias, mi gente. Thank you all for showing up. I see about 39 participants are in, so I'll do a couple of housekeeping items before I get into my introduction. Welcome to the 4th Annual EduColor Summit 2020. The first time it's been open to the general public. We've reorganized the organization and our new website, chock full of resources, just in preparation for this specific event. So thank you all for showing up. A special shout outs to the organizers who've helped construct this conference, this summit, Yemil Baez, Hema Kodai, Lorena Hedman, and Julia Torres, who you'll hear from later, obviously. Thank you all for your participation. We've had any number of attendees come to this function in the past from our own membership, but this one is dedicated to the people. This is our moment, is the theme. So we have any number of guidelines, which you should have received this morning, along with the schedule that we'll adhere to for the purpose of rest, reflection, and preparation. We've organized this as 50-minute sessions with 10-minute breaks because it allows for deep learning with moments for respiration and networking. We as EduColor also recognize the moment that we're in. We started as an organization where teachers could talk back to all white conferences, but we reformed as a group of educators and parents who knew what it meant to be ignored, dismissed, and disrespected by any number of spaces. Our schools, our unions, and our activist spaces didn't want to hear about anti-racism as a core pillar to the work we must do in schools. And still, we persisted and resisted. So as this summit is dedicated to those who've been here before, who know how racism and all its manifestations have shown up in our spaces, we know how powerful our collective is right here. We no longer wish to create our quiet corners after our colleagues leave so we can have the hard conversations. We distrust trends and fads in the name of legacy and staying true to our people. This powerful lens allows us to see the current moment in time as America continues to harm itself just to preserve white supremacy. Some of the people who feel no guilt wearing white sheets as they hang Black people from trees won't cover themselves with masks because masking is a liberty issue. We're in a moment of time of great economic stratification, hypercapitalism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, high-stakes testing, and other traditional monuments that must go down. This is why we refuse the 101 conversation. Educators know that the personal is the relational, is the political, is the historical, is the economic, is the systemic, is the personal, once again, for so many of us. And I could think of no other person who can speak to the legacy of the moment than Renee Moore. She and her husband, Clay Ernest Moore, have raised 11 children who all went to public school. She's a beacon of strength for her community in the Mississippi Delta, eventually having become, over the course of her career, a Milken Education Award winner, National Board Certified Teacher, a Spencer Fellow, a Spencer Foundation Award winner, and 2001 Mississippi State Teacher of the Year. She appears in books such as Teaching 2030 and Teacherpreneurs. She's been on the board of directors for the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards and the Mississippi Commission on Teachers and Administrator Licensure. She blogs under Teach More and serves on the board of directors as vice chair for the Center for Teaching Quality, where we first met. Her biography is extensive, but I'd like to take this point of personal privilege to also thank her for being her. She's been an inspiration for me and so many others since I started teaching in public, and I couldn't have been the teacher, the leader, the man I am today without so much of her leadership and guidance. With that said, please give it up for Renee Moore, y'all.
Good morning, EduColor. Can you all hear me all right? Somebody thumbs up me. Thank you, dear. And thank you, Jose, for that kind introduction. It's been a long journey. I've been a teacher a long time. And when you read, every time somebody reads one of my bios, I realize I've been doing this a long time. There's a story recounted in the book Legacy of Buxton about an enslaved Black woman named Jane on a plantation in Tennessee owned by a white man whose last name was Robbins. She had several children by her master, and just prior to the Civil War, Robbins promised another of his slaves, Dennis Calico, that if he would marry Jane, and they and the children all took the Robbins name, he would free them and send them to Canada to live as a family. Well, sometime after that, Jane and Dennis did arrive at the Dawn settlement in southwestern Ontario. And by the 1870s, some of their children would move to the nearby settlement of Buxton. Today, their descendants could probably be counted in the thousands, and I'm one of them. And I share Jane and Dennis's story to honor them because the life they made for themselves and for their descendants is how I came to be the person that I am and the teacher that I am. In my culture, we begin any event or endeavor by acknowledging elders and predecessors. And if you were raised in the Black church, as I was, you know the protocol, giving honor to God, who is the head of my life. And then we go down the list from the pastor to the parents. So perhaps coming from such a tradition is why I was so distressed about how my Black elders in the teaching profession have been not just ignored, but slandered. It's painful to me how little we know or acknowledge about the work of teachers of color before us. But what's even more painful is to hear Black educators participate in the dismissal and the dishonor of our predecessors. We have allowed ourselves to be lied to and lied about for too long. In fact, we have much to learn and much to celebrate and much work to finish in what has been passed to us. I've entitled this message, Libations and Batons. It is our moment. So what are we doing with what we've been entrusted? And what are we going to pass forward? I grew up in Michigan. I did not become an educator until my husband and I relocated our growing family here to my husband's home, the Mississippi Delta. That's been over 35 years ago. After I became a teacher and throughout my career, I've come to learn and respect the work of Black educators. There have been so many great individual teachers and scholars. The Anna Julia Coopers, the Mary McLeod Bethune, Benjamin Mays, Carter Woodson, John Robert Edward Lee, Horace Tate, Enola McMillan, Lawrence and Grace Jones, Barbara Sizemore, Asa Hilliard, Jacqueline Jordan Irvin, Gloria Ladson Billings, Joyce King, Mary Futrell, and my mentors, Dorothy Grinnell and Frances Isaac, and so many others. But more important though, and less well known, was the organizational work and the pedagogical legacy of these Black educators. One of our great educator researchers, Vanessa Siddell Walker, talks about the myth that Black teachers were incompetent, ineffective, and that they did little or nothing to help in the fight for liberation and civil rights. She cites one editorial that referred to Black teachers during the civil rights era as being worthless. Now, those of you who know Carol Anderson's work, when she talks about white rage, she says, America needs the myth of Black pathology, okay? But those myths about Black teachers just did not jive with my experience with the Black teachers of my childhood, who I found out later were all expatriate Southerners who had been displaced during the fight against desegregation. Let me take you back a little. When school desegregation finally occurred in the South, this is circa 1970. Notice how long that was after the Brown decision. The records of Black teachers and of our organizations were mysteriously and very deliberately destroyed. Many of our schools and our professional organizations were either closed or assimilated. Our teaching methods were discarded, and tens of thousands of Black educators were either demoted or removed. Now, according to Sadell Walker and other researchers, somewhere between 30 to 50,000 Black educators were fired during that period, probably more, because many districts in places like Arkansas didn't keep written documentation of what they did to Black teachers. Robert Hooker, in his report on the displacement of Black teachers in the 11 southern states, this is written in December of 1970, noted this: demotions, and he was talking about in Mississippi, demotions in Mississippi probably outstripped dismissals. Black department heads are almost non-existent, he said, and a common demotion practice is to relegate classroom teachers to the role of teacher aides. It was reported that Black teachers who were ordered rehired by the courts were being assigned to hall duty and study halls rather than to their classrooms. Now you have to realize that many of these Black teachers, especially in the principal at that time, had more advanced degrees and more years of experience than did their replacements. Well, during that same period, the Black Teachers Organization, the American Teacher Association, ATA, and its state affiliates began to merge with the National Education Association, the NEA. Black teachers had not been allowed in the NEA during segregation. And even after the national level voted to merge in 1966, state level mergers did not always go smoothly. According to Hooker and to elder Black teachers I know here in Mississippi, Mississippi and Louisiana, the NEA affiliates there, were expelled from the national body for refusing to merge with the Black teachers. So though in those two states, for a couple of years, the Black Teacher Association was the NEA affiliate. Many of the white teachers left the NEA affiliates to form another all-white professional educators group, which still exists today. In other southern states where there were mergers, the Black leaders of the former NEA affiliates were made assistants or put in secondary positions under the white NEA leaders. So Sadell Walker reveals how in some places, as soon as integration or in some cases merger occurred, the records, the files of these organizations suddenly come up missing. Now, after about 18 to 20 years of research that she did on the Black Teacher Association in Georgia, Sadell wrote in her book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, about how its president, Horace Tate, hid and thereby saved much of the documentation and the history of the Georgia Teachers Association. But my question is this: why this attack on the organizations and their documents? What had these organizations done that was so dangerously important that they had to be broken up and erased? And the first answer to that question is they taught. Black teachers over many decades had developed their own curriculum for Black children, and that both undermined and surpassed the approved curriculum. And they had developed their own pedagogy. Beyond that, they had their own professional learning network. Remember, we're talking the desegregation period. They had their own professional learning network to connect veterans and to mentor new teachers. They had all of that pre-integration and pre-internet. This work by Black teachers was designed to do what Joyce King challenges us to do, to protect and insulate Black children from the daily assaults on their spirits. So those Black teacher associations also, we now know, also served as covert grassroots networks that helped play a pivotal role in the larger civil rights movement. Dr. Greg Carr of Howard, some of you may be familiar, if you're not, you should be, with his work. Whenever he talks about Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carr always reminds us that Dr. Woodson always reminded us that Black History Week, which later became Black History Month, was intended to be a culmination, a demonstration, a celebration of what students had been learning all year long about Black history. That was its original intent. Well, teaching Black children about Black history wasn't part of any Southern state's official curriculum. So where did that plan come from? Where did that expectation come from? Give you another example. My elementary school in Detroit was staffed by and led by Black educators from the Deep South. When we completed the sixth grade, before we could pass on to what was then junior high, we had to stand on a stage before the school, our parents, and our teachers, and give something comparable to master's orals. We had to recite poems, long poems, several of them by Black poets. We had to recite historical facts, chunks of historical documents, excerpts from speeches, information about geography, science, and math. Now, the state of Michigan and the Detroit Public Schools did not require all of that from us, but in our community did. And when I moved south, I found out where that curriculum and where those high expectations for sixth graders originated. That was their moment. What are we doing with ours? When the Black students walked out of the high school where I taught, and this would be the late 90s, and marched to the superintendent's office demanding the reinstatement of a Black teacher who had been unjustly fired the week before, I was accused of leading, agitating, or at the very least, not trying to stop them. The real issue the white superintendent confronted me about, though, was, and these are her words, quote, "I was getting in her way," unquote. Now, with the passing and the funeral of John Lewis, that is even more of a compliment today than it was when she said it in my face. But now, at that time, I was the president of the local teachers association. And even though here in Mississippi, we have no bargaining power, no tenure protection, I did speak up for the teachers, but that wasn't what she was referring to. What she was really referring to was that what I and several of my Black colleagues who were also run out of the district had really gotten in the way of was what they were trying to do to Black children. With the passing, though, of our elders and our fighters, we lose not only their beautiful lives and their presence, but if we're not careful and cautious, we'll lose much of the hard-earned wisdom if we're not consciously and systematically paying attention, preserving, protecting, studying, and teaching what they taught us. If we don't do that, we're losing ground. Now, you know, I'm telling my age here, but that's okay. About every 10 years, since the supposed end of the official civil rights movement, just about every 10 years, America is shocked to learn that racism is still alive and well, right? So around 1980, a writer named Thomas Arneziga made this observation. Listen to this. He said, "Public education has successfully shifted the blame for the failure of schools to meet the needs of minorities onto the shoulders of the clients they purport to serve. They have pulled off the perfect crime, for they can never be truly held accountable since the reasons for failure in school are said to be the fault of poor homes, cultural handicaps, linguistic deficiencies, and deprived neighborhoods. The fact that schools are geared primarily to serve monolingual white middle-class citizens is never questioned. Now that was 1980, okay? About 10 years later, Elder Asa Hilliard, in an article with Gerald Pine, wrote something that could have been written this morning. Hear this. Every time we are almost convinced that the nation is rising above the muck of racism, there come reminders of how little headway we have made, even at eliminating the most vulgar and conspicuous manifestations of the disease. Blatant, crude, egregious, and overt racism has come out of the closet again and into our schools. Documented accounts of public slurs, threats, racist slogans, physical assaults, and racial conflicts now ring disturbingly from schools in every region of the country. Schools, which ought to be a civilizing influence in our society, seem instead to be incubators of racial intolerance. Racism, prejudice, and discrimination are shamefully sabotaging our nation's efforts to provide a quality education for all children. Now is our moment. What are we doing with it? Sadly, Siddle Walker notes that post-segregation teachers of Black children, she's talking circa the 1970s, so teachers who entered the profession after the 1970s, were what she called, quote, the first generation with no plan. The first generation with no plan. Hear me well. There has to be a plan beyond the demands. There has to be a plan beyond the demands. Otherwise, we're susceptible to something that looks like a win that's actually just a screen for continued oppression and can distract and divide our movement. The so-called integration specifically of Southern schools is a perfect example. Again, Siddle Walker says it best. She said, we exchanged caring school climates and powerful advocacy structures, which we had in those Black teacher associations, for the promise of access. Malcolm X said, only a fool would let his enemy educate his children. We should be wary of looking for solutions on how to best educate our children using prepackaged models designed and peddled by the same forces that have benefited from our oppression. We had culturally relevant, culturally effective, culturally engaged curriculum and teaching for our children, and we had well-developed systems for our own training and implementation. But like so much of our culture, there has been a concerted effort to steal, kill, and destroy it. In the Black church, there's an art form called the meter hymn. These songs take the lyrics of standard Protestant hymns, but they're sung in a call and response fashion to tunes which musicians tell me cannot be notated or written down. They are part of our oral tradition. And there are different types of meters from different parts of the rural South. Therefore, the only way meter hymns can be learned or passed down is if they're heard and then sung by one generation to the next. I am deeply encouraged that there appears to be growing interest among educators to revive and reclaim Black teacher-developed approaches to purposeful education, not only for Black children, but to help bring true education for all children. One recent example is Melanie Acosta, Michelle Foster, and Deidre Hoshin did a recent work on African American Pedagogical Excellence. And it's a wonderful piece, and I encourage you to read it. Another was a podcast called, I hope some of you are familiar with this, a podcast called The Urban Teachers Lounge by G. Fumaleo. And it was the one I was listening to was episode number 4 from February of 2019, in which she did, I thought, a wonderful review of a landmark book that was published in 2005, edited by Joyce E. King. It's called Black Education, a Transformative Research and Action Agenda for the New Century, which by now, that book should be foundational text for all teachers of Black children. But I was glad to hear this younger scholar promoting and introducing the work of some of our greatest Black educational minds to another generation of teachers of Black children. We should sit with our elders, either literally or vicariously through their writings. We should sit with them, and those who attended and worked in those Southern Black schools during the time of the Black Teacher Associations. And we should talk to them, listen to them about their teachers and about what they were taught and how. If we're going to make the most of our moment, we have to learn from these elders who, while forced into and fighting against appalling physical and social conditions, you can't even imagine what they were dealing with. But they developed and systematically instituted subversive, highly effective educational practices that sustained our people and helped produce generations of freedom fighters. Not necessarily that we should teach today what they taught then, although there was a lot of solid content there that's still true and necessary. But to understand their methodologies, especially their unified, intentional approach to the real purpose of education. Now, this seems to me especially important at this moment, when we, and especially our children, are facing frontal attacks on our lives and on our communities. So I end with a call for focus, for unity around purpose and principle. The concepts, for example, in the EduColor statement on educational policy are a good starting point for some planning, for some rebuilding. The forces arrayed against us and our children are entrenched, they're powerful, they're organized, and they think and plan in decades. We should set our priorities and recommit ourselves to working together in purposeful, organized ways towards those priorities. Because to paraphrase Ella Baker, we must pass on to others what has been passed on to us, because this is our moment. Thank you kindly. I'd like to hear from some of you now. Let's talk.
All right, folks, if you have questions, feel free to pop in a few questions in the Q&A box. Should be open to everybody. We have the next 20 minutes to do so.
You're welcome. I didn't do any fancy slides and, stuff. So you had nothing to pretend to look at while I was talking.
Renee,
Who said that was the whole sermon?
I love it. Do you want me to read you the questions, or you got it?
Well, now I can see some of them, but there may have been stuff that went earlier because I wasn't paying attention. So just don't let me miss anybody's question. If somebody
Not a problem.
And I'll be glad to go on and talk about some other stuff too. We don't have to stay on message. If you want to get nosy, ask me some personal stuff, that's fine too.
All right, we'll go with the Q&A box first, and then so do you want me to read it aloud, or you got it on your side already?
Actually, I'm not seeing the Q&A box, so go ahead and tell me what I'm
All right, love it. This is from Lorena Hedman. Can Renee speak on the reality of potential homeschooling right now in the face of pandemic 2020, but also considering the impact on public schools? Just any general thoughts or ideas?
Homeschooling in general, you know, as a starting point, I believe every parent has the right to choose whatever educational format is best, you know, for their children. And that to me is a fundamental principle. Homeschooling has picked up in popularity among Black parents. We have many, many more Black parents and parents of color who are turning to homeschooling who would not necessarily consider that before. Partly it has to do with the pandemic, but a large part of it has to do with frustration over public schools, period. They're just tired of the year in, year out, day in, day out fight with public school systems to educate our children. So they're turning to homeschooling as a viable option. And I understand that frustration because when your children are growing up, like Jose, you mentioned I have raised 11 children. We've sent them all through public school. It's wearying, the daily fight with the system to over our children. And some parents have the wherewithal and the means to do that fight day in and day out. Some of them just, you know, would say, no, my child's getting older, and while I'm fighting the system to make public education better, in the meantime, my own child is getting older by the day. And what's happened. So I understand that pull. We chose to stay and fight it out. But I do understand very much the move to homeschool. And homeschooling can be an organized thing. You do understand that. Just because they're being homeschooled doesn't mean necessarily they're isolated. Because you can still operate a purposeful curriculum and connect those homeschool students and connect those homeschool parents and connect educators. And it has been done like that in some places. So it's not entirely a bad thing. It does, however, cause problems for us who are struggling the fight in public schools. Because anytime you pull people and resources away from the public schools, you're actually pulling people and resources away from us and our children. So it is a battle, and it has to be fought, I think, on both fronts. But like I said, I understand the tension there. And of course, the forces who want to undermine public schools use anything to their advantage. So they would say, oh yeah, pull your kid out, homeschool them, and we'll give you a voucher to take them somewhere else, or to pay for the homeschooling, or to send them to private school. We've seen all of that in different places, and in Mississippi, it takes on its own unique form. So I wouldn't necessarily dump on parents who want to homeschool, but I see it as one part of a bigger, of the same fight, I guess I would say.
Excellent. Marion Dingle writes, I Googled meter hymns and came up with nothing. Do you have a suggestion of how to research this?
Yes. To find meter hymns, you need to go on YouTube. And what you probably want to do is, if not searching by meter hymn, but search by individual churches and singers of songs. And there'll be things like, Father, I stretch my hands to thee, and a charge to keep I have. Now that's a good one. A charge to keep I have. And I have some YouTube links. Marion, if you email me, I will send you the links, because I keep them on my YouTube channel, the meter hymns. But they have to be heard. It's a form of singing that you can't write it down and learn to play it. You have to hear it, somebody sing it, and so you can repeat it. And as children, we disparage the meter hymns, right? We think, what are those old folks doing? It sounds like they just moaning, and they're not even saying anything. But then we realize how valuable those art forms were as we got older. I will not sing one for you now, but I could. They deserve to be preserved. But that's how you find them. Go to YouTube, send me an email, and I'll send you a direct link.
I love that. Gerardo Munoz, what does it take for teachers of color to stay committed to this work despite oppressive systems that are trying to get rid of us?
Ooh, if I knew the answer to that question. The main thing it's taken for me has been network, number one. Connecting with other teachers. That's why things like EduColor are so vital. Because it's easy to get isolated, it's easy to get worn down when there's just you, particularly if you're in a setting where you're in predominantly white structure. Even if you're not, it's still easy to get worn down. So networking is critical. Networking with people, both as widely and broadly as you can. The other one is to be grounded in the purpose, which is why I'm coming back to looking at these Black elder teachers. They had a unifying curriculum. This is our purpose. This is what we're trying to do for Black children. This is what we're going to teach them. This is how we're going to teach them. They had that to pull them. That's what held them together. And a lot of these people didn't necessarily like each other. I need to get this out here. They didn't necessarily like each other. They didn't necessarily get along. There was all the egos and things. And I'm not suggesting that all Black teachers of the past were great teachers. I'm certainly not suggesting that then or now. But there was this core of purpose and values that they unified around, and that kept them anchored. And for them to say sustained, when I feel pressured about my situation and want to quit, I look back at them and what they had to go through. And living in Mississippi has given me just so much insight on what they went through. For them to maintain and to sustain that when there looked like there was no hope of success in the larger realm, political realm, to me is amazing that they were able to sustain it for as long as they did and sustain it very well. So those two things, networking and then being anchored in a core purpose and curriculum around which to focus so that you can keep your focus on what you're doing for the children. It helps to stave off some of that other outside pressure.
Love that. I'm going to take questions from Julia Torres, then Moriah, then Lillian. Julia Torres writes, or Julia Torres, if you're doing Spanish, right? What is something you have seen work to effectively bring folks together whom society has intentionally and consistently kept apart? Example, folks teaching in urban school districts and those in independent schools.
What have I seen work? Let's see. Going through my file here. Again, the concept of principles comes up. I've seen people across categories and levels who can, but they agree on the same principles as far as, you know, what we should be teaching, what's important. Those things tend to bridge across those divides. Now, I need to say this whole, thing about public, private, independent, I refuse to get drawn into that, charter, no charter, all that kind of, I don't even participate in that particular discussion because it's a diversion to me. So those of you who are over there, you have your debate, but for me, it's a diversion. What's the best way to educate our children across the board where they are? I've seen some really good community-run, teacher-run, charter independent schools. I've seen some lousy ones. And same thing with public, obviously. So those who get it right, because they are centered on some key principles about what's best for our children, what's best for us as human beings. And they focus on that as opposed to the other agendas. It's anti-racist, it's cultural in its nature, in its core. It's uplifting at its core. And that, to me, is the unifying factor that we can use to bridge across. And we could get more specific about that. I want to, dive too much into details of that, but those things will unify people across those bridges, and the common battle against the common, in a common struggle will unify people where other things bridge them. I don't believe in grade levels either. Have I mentioned that today? I don't believe in grade levels. I don't believe in this higher education, lower education. I just don't. One is a parent, because I've raised 11 children. And all of this thing about grade level, student, the child's got to be at grade level. I haven't raised a child yet that was at grade level, okay? They develop differently, they have different skills, they mature in different ways, they learn in different ways. I really just totally disregard the reading wars, for example. You must have phonics. You can't have phonics. You know, I don't even deal with that because I raised 11 children. That's an addition to the thousands of children I've taught. Okay, I have one child. The best reader in my family is my son, who is deaf, for whom phonics are completely useless. But his reading comprehension is amazing. For those of you who are into scores, he's never scored less than 95 percentile on any reading test. This boy used to read encyclopedias on his bed for fun. Okay, no phonics. We also have a daughter, though, who has dyslexia. Without phonics, she wouldn't be reading today. That was the only way she learned to read. Got other children who were taught to read the way I learned to read, which is whole words, you know, sight words. So this whole thing about there's only one way to do it and you got to do it this way. That's why I meant earlier about, you know, us adopting these models that are designed by other folks about what's best for our children. We need to walk away from that and look at you know, our children through a whole different way and center our teaching on them and not on models. All right, stop, Renee, you're preaching again. Okay.
Do it. So we got 10 more minutes. Here's the next one from Moriah Stevens. Can you please restate who said the quote about public education shifting the blame, schools being built for white monolingual students and not being questioned, from 1980? Thank you.
That quote is in an article by Asa Hilliard and Gerald Pine. They actually quote him in their article. And the title of the article just slipped past me right then, but I can get it for you. It's actually a quote within an article from Asa Hilliard that he wrote in 1990 with Gerald Pine. And for the life of me, I can't pull up the title of that article right now. But I'm sure if you search Asa Hilliard, that will come up. But they're quoting him. And his name, the person who actually said it, is Thomas Arnasija. I actually wrote that down. And I'll find it for you, and I'll give it to you, and I'll text it to you, or I'll put it in the chat box whenever I find it.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a powerful quote too. That's extremely powerful. ARCINIEGA. I said that like y'all actually gonna write it down. Wait, I keep forgetting what age I'm in.
I mean, we also have it transcripted, so folks can also follow them too. The fact that you spelled it out, everybody got it.
I hope I put that on my list of resources. I put a list together of things that I refer to in the talk, so that's on a PDF. Somebody can get that. I think that's right. But anyway, but it's in the article by Hilliard. That's the main thing to look for. It's the article by Asa Hilliard.
Excellent. I see a couple of questions I'm gonna take from Lillian, Kalila, then Shanae, yes. So I have Lillian. Out of curiosity, what are you currently reading? Always looking for new books, articles, blogs, podcast recommendations.
Well, on any given day now, I read a lot of stuff, and I like to go back. I like to reread stuff. So in summertime, just before school starts, is when I do my rereading. So I'm actually going back and looking at some things. One of the things I'm rereading is Dream Keepers by Gloria Ladson-Billings. I revisited that recently. The History of White People, I just got through reading again. What else is around here? Look, I'm checking my shelf. The podcast I mentioned, that by G. Fun Maleo, I really enjoyed those podcasts. I'm going to go look for the rest. She has some more. I'm going to go look for those. The Urban Teachers Lounge, I found those to be helpful. But this is my time of year when I go back and reground. I'll read Strength to Love by Martin Luther King before I step back in the classroom. I'll reread my National Board Standards before I go back in the classroom. Summertime is my time to kind of reset myself and rezone. So if any of those works are things you haven't read yet, and they all bear reading again. And that book that I mentioned by Joyce King, The Black Tradition, Black Education, Transformative Education. it's a collection of some amazing pieces by some really outstanding scholars. And it's good to go back and look at those things again and remind ourselves. Did I mention Lisa Delpit today? When's the last time you went back and reread some Lisa Delpit? Particularly the observations that she makes about children and infants, and how if you start the children off, everybody at the same level, how the children of color tend to develop faster. And it's not until they reach school age that they begin to regress. I just need to remind ourselves about that every once in a while.
That's real. Thank you for that. I have Kalila. Can you clarify the difference between homeschooling and forming collectives to support small groups of kids through distance learning? Many seem to be saying they're homeschooling when they aren't, and it muddies the waters.
Okay, I need the questioner to clarify that for me, because homeschooling by definition is a parent or parents working with their own children in their own house, period. That's homeschooling. Once you extend beyond that and become part of some kind of a network or collective, you're homeschooling, essentially you're homeschooling, but you're becoming part of a broader collective and network. And many homeschool parents are part of broader collectives and network. And I don't really think, I don't understand why muddying the water is a bad thing. So maybe I'm not understanding the question clearly, because those two things need to be interconnected. And there is no one way to do homeschooling, and there's no one way to do the collective piece either, because it looks different in different places, in different cultures. So I don't think we have to be real stickler about, it's got to be this. If you're not doing this, you're not doing homeschooling. If you're not doing that, you're doing something else. I think it's going to be it has to be much more fluid than that, and it probably is in most places, and should be.
That's a worthy discussion, especially as white parents seek to create pods for their own kids.
Mm-hmm. That is a discussion worth having. I've seen different formations of that and different iterations of that. And the resources that are available to you when you're homeschooling, and this is pertinent at this point, the resources that are available to some parents obviously are not the resources that are available to other parents. So who you connect with makes a lot of difference to what your child then is able to benefit from, and how those connections are made and the purpose of those connections. One of my visions for education, I had hoped by now, and certainly for the future, one of my visions for education was that school buildings, as we currently know them, would become hubs, like community hubs, and that the real education takes place not actually at the building, but around in the community around the building, that the whole community becomes a place of learning. And the school building serves as a hub for services, for taking care of things that need to be done in group and in process. It's where the resources might be concentrated so that they could be distributed, but not school in the way that we know it now, that, we herd the kids into school and we have school and then they go home. I've been wanting us to get away from that for a long time.
Yeah, and Kalila actually followed up by just saying that she was speaking on the difference between planning and preparing your own curriculum versus what the schools have to offer. So, but in the interest of time, and I thank you for that, Kalila, as well. That was amazing. I think that's worth a whole discussion actually on EduColor Chat.
Yes, it is.
For sure. Shanice writes, Shanice mostly, Renee, you spoke about Black teachers working together. I'm wondering how you have been able to find and foster community when teaching under oppressive conditions within oppressive systems.
Give me that one more time.
Okay, Renee, you speak about Black teachers working together. I'm wondering how you have been able to find and foster community when teaching under oppressive conditions and within oppressive systems.
I'll answer that on two levels. Even within the most oppressive of school systems, dysfunctional school systems, there are like minds. And if you're willing to step out of your classroom for 2 seconds and look around you, you'll find there are like minds, even where you are, and connecting with those like minds and supporting each other is important. Because one of the things we found, for example, the districts I've worked in here in the city, they like to keep us apart, tear us apart, turn us against one another, lie to one about the other, just anything to keep us, you know, divided and fighting ourselves. We found when we got together though and talked to each other, we realized we had, there were other people who were thinking and doing some of the same things I was thinking and doing, and they were right there in my building. I didn't even realize it because I had dismissed, you know, I wasn't trained that way. I wasn't trained to dismiss like teachers. I was taught to listen to them and to pay attention to them. But a lot of our younger teachers who brought into the system, it's like they're pre-programmed to not listen to the veteran teachers, not to listen to the other teachers. So they don't realize that they're actually kindred spirits with them and make those connections. Outside of your building, outside of your district, it's important to connect. We have all kinds of ways to connect in networks, for which I'm very grateful. I'm part of many networks of teachers around the country, around the world. And those connections are extremely important because it gives you a sense of being part of something that's much bigger than just your provincial area. So for me, those intentional networks outside of my district and then looking for like minds within my setting and then trying to bridge those two things together was important. It was stunning to me. One of the reasons I study the work of these elder scholars so much is this is so reaffirming. It's humbling and it's reaffirming because I see things, I say, wow, I wasn't the first person to think of this. Somebody else did this. Then I realize how long ago they did it. Then I really get angry, right? It's like, why am I just now seeing this for the first time? But those connections are there. We just have to purposefully look for them and help each other make them and find them. There's more people out here who are fighting and doing what you think you're doing by yourself than you realize. And that's important to keep in mind because otherwise we tend to get this hopeless feeling and frustrated feeling. But there's more of us than you think.
All right, we have 2 more questions and that'll wrap up the 5 minutes we got. That's excellent, thank you so much. Shanae Bond says, what considerations do you believe we need to make in light of COVID-19 as a public health crisis impacting communities of color in regard to the education of our children?
Oh, Lord. Where do I begin? The health, the safety, the security of our children should be always the first thing. Everything else should come from there. And then, of course, our own health and safety. The fact that this virus affects communities of color and people of color more so than other communities is not an accident, and it should be a signal. The real problem that I see in that question is that not what I think should be done, but that what I think should be done, I'm the last person the people who are making these decisions are going to listen to about what should be done. Okay. So where I live, for example, we're about to go back to school. I'm talking 2 weeks, face to face, okay, in classrooms. And the schools are being forced to do that. They're being pushed to do that. And off their funds is being used to force our children and our teachers back into unsafe situations. Okay, as if our personal health and our lives don't matter. Many of the children we teach have underlying health conditions themselves. So when when you hear this general chatter about, well, the kids will catch it like they're gonna catch a cold, like the kids will catch it, but then they'll get over it. They might carry it to somebody else, but I'm looking at kids who are on insulin, kids who got asthma, kids who have heart problems. These are young people, okay? Children. Anyway, so this whole thing of making decisions about other people's children that you would never make for yourself, for your own children, is one thing. But then we got some who would make those same decisions for themselves and their own children. Well, if you want to endanger your life and your child's life, but again, those decisions are being made without regard to us. And the only way we're going to deal with that is at an organized grassroots. Parents and teachers are coming together in ways I haven't seen in a long time around this issue. And to take, you know, to tell these people, no, you're not just going to endanger my child and my family like that just because you want to. What is so magical about August and September anyway? Who said we got to start school next week? 180 days. That's the schedule we've been on for over 100 years. I used to sit on the board of directors of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Y'all heard of the Carnegie Foundation? Those are the people that invented the Carnegie unit, okay? The whole idea of seat time. The Carnegie Foundation, the folks who invented seat time and Carnegie units, said over almost 20 years ago now that that system is antiquated, that we shouldn't even be using that anymore. But these school systems and these districts are locked into this thing. We got to do 180 days. We got to do it like this. We got to have school from September to June. Learning takes place 365 days a year. Learning takes place anytime you got children asking questions. So, you know, all this, we got to go back to school. They're going to be behind. Behind what? Behind who? Who says they're behind? And so what? So I meet the child where he or she is, or they are at this moment, and start teaching. And I teach them until I've taught them all I can teach them, and then somebody else teach them. It ain't hard. It ain't rocket science. But it does take compassion. It takes humanity. But this thing about so a lot of these decisions are being forced by systems and things that are in place that were created by human beings and that could just as easily be dismantled and discarded by human beings. But you know, that takes organized struggle, and that's what I'm glad to see. I'm glad to see parents, students, and teachers coming together in organized opposition to this imposition of things on us in the name of education.
My elder, thank you so much, Renee Moore. You are so appreciated. Thank you very, very much. In the interest of time, apologies to Nina. We're not able to answer your question right now, but feel free to follow Renee on Twitter at.
Do follow me.
Yes, please follow her on Twitter because she's fire there too. So we're definitely gonna put that out there. That's at Teach More, TEACHMOORE. But other than that, everyone, please thank Renee Moore for her fantastic presentation, and we hope to see you in the next 5 minutes at the next session. Correct? So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Love you all.
Much love to you.